Ah, well, after a little break, I'm back. And we're back with the eLiquid database. And that's what I'm going to call it, the eLiquid database. So, yeah, I really need to crack on with this thing. I need to get it finished. And at the pace we've been going, yeah, it's going to take a while. So I'm going to speed things up a little bit. Sort of halfway through, no, probably more than halfway through, I've decided it would be a good idea to plan it a bit. Because I'm losing track of exactly what it is this thing needs to do. So we've got here a little bit of set of notes in PowerPoint. And so we've got the main functionality that we can define. And the main functionality really is to store and maintain stock levels of my e-liquid ingredients, so that I know how much I've got and whether I've got enough to make a certain mix of a certain recipe. And alongside that, really, we need to be able to store the recipes because, well, in order to know whether we can make a recipe with the ingredients we have, we need to know what that recipe is. We've kind of dealt with some of this. Storing stock levels, yeah, well, we've got the stock table that stores all of the information about the stock. Maintain stock levels, well, we're not really doing anything about maintaining them yet. We've put them all in there, but that's it. We haven't built any front end to actually change the stock levels. And stock levels are going to change when we make a mix. We'll use some ingredients, so they'll go down. And we also need the ability to be able to add new stock when we buy new bottles to replenish ingredients used, or indeed even new ingredients. So we'll need to get around to that. We've added a new ingredient form, but we haven't added anything where we can increase our amount of stock. So yeah, we'll need to get around to that, and we'll also obviously need to get around to the main bit of it, which is reducing the amount of stock when it's used in a mix. We've kind of dealt with keeping recipes. We've got our recipe form, and yeah, that's kind of pretty much done. So the next main thing is logging the mixes that we make of those recipes. So yeah, this is where we will, well, first of all, it's going to tell us how to make the recipe, what ingredients it's got. It's going to tell us how much of each ingredient we'll need for a certain quantity that we're going to make in the mix. And it will also then maintain the stock level using up those ingredients as we make a mix. So that's the next thing we're going to look at. But looking ahead slightly, there is some additional functionality that I probably will add when everything else is done. And that really is at the moment just tracking the costs. So let's go back to the next bit we really need to crack on with, and that's logging the mixes of recipes. We call that mix management, or at least I'm calling it mix management. So this really is the most important part of the database, because everything we've done up till now kind of doesn't really benefit from moving from Excel. But this part of it will, because there's a lot more intelligence, if you like, involved in doing it. So the main things that the mix management part of the database is going to do for us is, well, we'll go in and we'll say, yep, I want to make a mix of a certain recipe, and we click on it, and yeah, we start the mix process. So we're going to have to record a date, so we'll enter a date and the actual amount of that recipe that we want to make to create the mix. And that will then work out how much of each ingredient is needed and display it for us. It will then sort of help us decide which actual bottles we'll use, because it knows the ingredient. It also has stored all the bottles that we have, so it can present us with choices. Do you want to use this bottle of custard or that bottle of custard, or a mix if there isn't enough in one? And then finally it's going to update those stock tables so that everything is in line and the ingredients reflect reality once we've made the mix. So where we're going to start with it is the basic structure. Unfortunately, it's going to require two tables, a lot like recipes. So basically one of the tables is going to store all of the things that are, you know, one-to-one relationship, where there's just one piece of information needed for that particular mix, like the date and the quantity. And then, as again with your recipes, we'll have another table that stores items where there's multiple items per mix, and that is basically the ingredients. So if we knock on over to the database, what we've got here is our existing recipe table and our existing recipe ingredients table. So as you can see, we had this where we stored things that there's one of per recipe, i.e. the percentage of the Nick and the percentage of the VG, and that was about it. And then for the recipe ingredients, this is where we stored all of the ingredients, because we don't know if there's 1 or 10 ingredients, so this needs to be in a separate table which are tied together by an ID. So if we close those two, you'll notice that I have already created 2 new tables, one called mixes, and if we have a look at the design view of that, very quickly we've got a couple of IDs. We've got the ID of the mix, which is just a reference to this actual mix. Then we've got the recipe ID, which is going to be tied to the recipe ID in the recipes table, and that will come from the requested recipe. So when we click on a recipe and say, yeah, make a mix of that, it's going to pass over this ID so that we can get any of the rest of the data that we need from the recipe. So that will include things like the name, the VG-PG mix, the nicotine target, and maybe a couple of other bits and pieces. So also in this table we'll store the date that the mix is made, the actual amount of mix that we're making, the volume, 100 ml, 1 litre, whatever it happens to be, and a few other bits and pieces that are basically not that important, they're just information based stuff. I've also included in this table some costings, which as we just saw a minute ago are kind of going to be nice to have. I'll do them at the end, so as you can see we're going to ignore them for now. So that deals with all the sort of single item fields that are required for a mix. Then if we have a look at the mix ingredients table, this is where each of the ingredients are going to be detailed, and this is a little bit more complicated than the recipe ingredients table, because we could be using more than 1 bottle of each ingredient. So let's have a little look. Again, we've got some IDs, and this mix ingredient mix ID will match the actual mix ID here, so that when this long list of ingredients is stuck in there in the table, it's going to be able to find out which ones relate to the mix that we're talking about and show us those. We will then have the mix ingredient name, which will obviously come from the recipe, the percentage of that ingredient, which will also come from the recipe, and then we're going to have some calculations to do. So it's going to work out for us, depending on how much of this actual mix we want to make, the volume of the mix overall, or what the volume of this particular ingredient is needed, and then also the weight of that ingredient, and that's what we'll use to actually make the mix. And we've got some costing stuff here that we're also going to ignore rather for now. And then we've got basically what I've decided should be enough is 3 individual options for this ingredient. Now, to begin with, I was only going to put 1 in, but what happens if you need, let's say, 10 ml of an ingredient and you've only got 8 ml in 1 bottle, but you actually have another full bottle sitting there ready to go? Well, we're going to use 8 ml from the first bottle and then 2 ml from another bottle. In such a scenario where it may be needed to use 3 different bottles of an individual ingredient, I've allowed for 3. If it's more than 3, well, that would be weird, and well, it's not going to work. But I can't really see that happening. And then the last one here is the running total, i.e. this is something that we're just using to track how much total of the ingredient we have selected so far. So if we've selected 8 from the first bottle but nothing else, then the running total is 8, and if we needed 10%, that obviously isn't enough. That's just something that's there for us to use along the way. So those are the tables all done and dusted, and the next thing to do is to start creating the forms, which we'll get to tomorrow. Watching paint dry would be more interesting.